My question is sort of the legal one to Dr. Godfrey. You mentioned that Statistics South Africa's measure of informal employment is not a very good, isn't very closely lined with compliance. I was wondering if you could just say a little bit more about what you meant there. In particular, the definition which they release with the QLFSs defines employees that they think are in the informal sector, meaning, according to their definition, they work in firms of less than 5 people and they don't have tax deducted from their salaries. Is that what you had in mind, or was it the broader definition that they report to the ILO, informal employment more broadly, which would include precarious types of employment? Maybe that's just more a question of clarification.
Right, thank you. Are there any more questions on this side of the room? Yes, sir. Pandile?
Thank you again for the opportunity. This is my last question now. I'm not going to ask another one. This last question I'm asking is this the final nail in the coffin of adopting the national minimum wage of 4.5? Or is it still in a process of research initiative? Then if it's not a final coffin, the nail in the final coffin, I'll appeal to this house that if VETS could create what we call fees must fall, it's now the time that we also create hashtag legal national minimum wage must be 12,500, because 4,500 won't do anything for anybody. It's either you're rich, you're poor, or you're educated. One more last thing. I've learned that in this conversation with all these people, that this is a very important matter, because now we are deciding the future of the poor people. It means the future of the poor people is being decided by the educated and the rich. Thank you very much.
Right. There was another hand in the middle here, Pandile.
I've got a Bandi Lengiti from the Research Initiative. It's got a question for. Oh, sorry. A question for Dr. Godfrey. From your understanding of how exemptions have worked in South Africa, and especially the case-by-case exemptions, what is your general picture? So off of a discussion that was had in the last Q&A about how there's big business who the conventional views that the big business can't afford to pay the minimum wage, and then there's others on the other side who are worried about small and medium enterprises, and there's the view from one of the participants about which factories would be closed down because they can't afford to comply, this type of thing. What's your sense? What's your nuanced sense of the proportions of all these different types of businesses that would need to be taken into consideration when we set the level? So how much what is the proportions of different types of businesses that could be that we must keep in mind when we consider the level at which a minimum wage is set?
Okay, thank you. Right, can we move to this side of the room now? Right at the back and then in the middle, and then to Neil.
My question would be to Shane. And I think it's linked to the discussion that happened the previous. Sorry. Am I audible? Hey? Like this? Oh, okay. It's linked to the debate, the discussion that happened the previous panel. Someone from India made the point that one of the key problems about national minimum wage is enforcement and monitoring. Now we have a dysfunctional inspectorate in this country, so to say that. There's no inspection, sometimes there's collusion alleged, and so on and so on. And I don't think that, it seems to me that we have the institutional capacity to ensure that, I mean, it happens. What is it that, I mean, is there a discussion, one, and how do we remedy that? Because I think that that's where the problem would be.
Right, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, we'll raise that a little later. In the middle down there.
Hello. This is not a question. This is a comment, and I think I will have to start by saying, Alena, you made me feel so relieved by responding to the question that I asked the Nedlac man, Neil, and we disagreed. And in fact, to him, it does not really make sense. Neil, don't take it personal. I just wanted to say, you know, we feel bad in most instances where our government is abdicating responsibility and their accountability. But your comprehensive slides there made me feel so good. And I think it might not only be myself, probably some other people at road. Because if you say something and you do not walk the road, you don't take the lead, then how do you expect the business to follow what we are talking about? All in all, what I'm saying is that I still say and emphasize, and thank you for the backup. Our government is supposed to incentivize. I'm talking of tax rebate, those tax incentives. And that will balance the scale. You cannot be talking about national economic wage when you are looking on the one side of the approach and not the other side. The balance should be balanced. You know?
Right, we've heard the question.
Yeah.
Thank you. We're going to move
Thank you
on
very much.
to the middle. Yes.
Hi, Neil from Labour, not the Nedlac man. My question's for Gabriel. Gabriel, could you say something about the debates that took place in the German trade union movement around the national minimum wage and the fact that some of the unions, to start off with, were against the idea of the national minimum wage, and a union like yourselves championed the national minimum wage, but some of the stronger, more established, I guess, higher paid unions were against it. Can you talk about that and perhaps the coalition that you built in society, which ultimately won the battle for the national minimum wage of €8.50? How did you achieve that?
Okay, thanks. There was a sort of, there's a late hand there at the back there. So this is becoming something like an auction.
Yeah. Oh, hi. Thanks. I think this one is more or less a comment about the beginning council, the collective, beginning council. I can say in South Africa, we've been waiting with anticipation for the Falam Commission, asking ourselves how long it will cost, the Holocaust, how long it will cost for the collective beginning of the Americana Commission to suffice. So we hear they are currently on that issue of beginning for the 1.8 billion compensation from the government. So the collective bargaining is only gonna be focused only on the government, even though the employees are working for the private sector within the public sphere. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, we take that comment. Yes, ma'am.
So this is a question for Gabrielle. The German national minimum wage excludes trainees, correct? Excludes trainees. And so I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about what the rationale was and the nature of the debate on that question specifically. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So can we proceed from my right hand, Gabrielle first, and then onward?
Thank you for the questions. I want to answer the second question first. I think because there is a tradition that trainees are no workers, and also legally they are more like pupils. They are in process of education and no workers. So, and because they are no workers, they have no minimum wage, but a kind of remuneration during this time of trainees. So, yeah, and I think we accepted also in this context that also in our collectively agreed wages, trainees are not included in the wage system, but have their own very much smaller remuneration systems. So this is a bit of tradition in Germany that they are in the education system, less or more, because they have to go twice a week to school and 3 days in the enterprise, in the company to learn. And they have to learn and not to work. And this is what trade unions also point out always. They have to learn and not to work. So it is not allowed to give them simple works where they cannot learn something. And to Alan, oh yes, the debate about the minimum wage. This was a very hard and long ongoing debate, and initially even my trade union was against the demand of a legal minimum wage. Yeah, it was because, and it is because of the strong tradition of free collective bargaining. This is also outside of some rational considerations, because it's the heart of our self-understanding, the free collective bargaining. And there, where it was still strong, and the export industry, metal industry, chemistry, they feared that there will be a pressure downward when there is a legal minimum wage. And we argued, oh no, this is a wage floor, and it helps us to bargain, to negotiate better wages. Yes, and in the end, I think they agreed in 2006, because also in the metal industry, there was a development of decentralization and outsourcing of so many parts of the factory. Not only the simple work, but also very qualified work. And even this very proud trade union has got more and more under pressure, and made the experience that it could be not so bad to have legal minimum wage, and also because IG Metall is also responsible for the textile industry and the wood processing industry, and there are very low wages, and also in chemistry they are responsible also for the leather industry and shoemakers and so on, with very, very low wages. So yes, I think in the end they were not very much in favor for a legal minimum wage, but they accepted that the Confederation ran that it was a common demand, and the Confederation ran a campaign. And yes, I think this is the main point of the story.
Thank you. Elena, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I just want to make a brief comment on tax relief and other things. Firstly, I want to point that tax incentives are one of the 5 mentioned incentives, right? So there are others. And second, I just want to say that in as much as they sound very appealing to business, they can put a lot of strain on the fiscus, and they can put a lot of strain on the budget. But what is a lot worse is that they can be, unless they're targeted, they can become a sort of subsidy to your capital, rather than incentivizing compliance. And I just think that this is something worth noting. The most successful tax incentives, like the Brazil one and the French one, are very, very targeted towards certain specific sectors or enterprises size and have a very certain time frame and tax cuts. Yeah, that's my quick comment.
Thanks very much.
Thanks. Just on the Stats SA definition, I was referring to the primarily tax compliant definition that Stats SA are used. I wasn't aware that, have they adopted that new ILO definition that is looking at both enterprise and employee condition? Sort of. Yeah, and I mean, the problem is they've changed their definition quite a lot over the years as well. I mean, the problem with measuring compliance with labor legislation is that there's not, yes, you're compliant, or no, you're not. It's actually really difficult to establish compliance. One can't do it in a quick questionnaire. And there's often degrees of compliance. So there might be compliance with a whole set of conditions in a collective agreement, but non-compliance with certain conditions and with wages. So you actually need a spectrum of total compliance through to total non-compliance, and then sort of grades in between those. But again, it's a question of measurement. But the point, I think the point I was trying to make is that we're accepting this Stats SA definition of informal employment, and we're using that data a lot, and I think we get into a mode of often not questioning the way they're defining that, and is that really giving us the data that we should be looking at? So it was just to raise that question. The short answer on the question about exemptions is that I can't give you the answer about the sort of proportion breakdown that you were looking for. The bargaining councils don't capture that data in that sort of detail. So I haven't seen anyone. There've been a couple of studies now, and there's a reasonable amount of data on exemptions, but not broken down at the level that you're looking at, which is obviously really important to try and get to that level. But that's the short answer there. Yeah, just on the question of enforcement and monitoring from the back there, it's going to be dealt with in the next session. I think what was important about this session was to look at incentives, which Elena touched on, and I was also going to mention this incentive of the Clothing Bargaining Council that has the Bargaining Council certificate that then opens certain doors at the DTI in terms of their programs and so on. I think the point of that is that Neil mentioned it, Elena and I, that's the one incentive that we all came up with, and I think it's because it's the only one. So we've been really bad about incentivizing compliance, trying to get employers to participate in bargaining councils through incentives. We've relied on a very traditional sort of big stick inspections and enforcements approach. So I think certainly to the extent that the national minimum wage debate is opening up the issue of incentives and incentivizing compliance with labor regulation, I think is a really important issue.
Well, thank you very much. Do you have one last burning question? Okay, quickly.
Hi, I'm Nikolai from WITS. I just reflecting on your response to this question. What I get from what you and Elena said is that yes, we need to think about incentives, but even those incentives to be effective would require quite a substantial amount of capacity for monitoring and implementation. In other words, and I think you're right, Elena, a blanket tax break would just be a subsidy. It wouldn't certainly not be an instrument to encourage compliance. Building this into public procurement alongside Black economic empowerment, for example, is also an excellent idea. But there's a serious problem, again, with monitoring compliance. And we know that both in the Department of Labor, whether it's in research or enforcement, and in the DTI, there are very, very, very serious capacity issues. And I think one thing that's just want to say is I agree that we also need to think about creative ways to promote compliance with the minimum wage and with labor law in general. But none of these ways can allow us to think that we can save on seriously building implementation capacity within the state for these key functions. And my honest opinion, view on this is that it's not that it's bad luck that we have a weak Department of Labor or a weak DTI. I mean, there's been very clear policy decisions that were made in the 1990s that led us to where we are today. And for example, I find it still today very, very shocking that when the Department of Labor has to regulate a sector, it asks the ECC to advise, and the ECC has to outsource its research to a consultancy company instead of having in-house capacity to form its own opinion on how the sector should be regulated. So all I wanted to say is, yes, incentives are needed, or creative thinking is needed because compliance is a big issue, but I would agree with the person in the back that we need to take government capacity very, very seriously, because unions represent barely a third of workers in this country, so the state needs to do something.
Okay, thank you very much for that comment. So it remains for me to thank the panel. Thank for being such an obedient and graceful group in terms of watching the time. I apologize if I harassed you a little bit. And now I want to hand over to Gilad. Thank you very much.